Well, hello everybody, I'm Pastor Bear, and I think SHTF is stupid. What do I mean by SHTF is stupid? I think that term, SHTF, the shit has hit the fan, is too ambiguous because that looks very different for different people. And there's a wide array, myriad different scenarios that could comprise SHTF, which leads to chaos when people are trying to prepare for SHTF, man. Well, what is SHTF? See, a lot of people in the prepper space think that it's going to be a single event, whether that's the Iranian sleeper cells and the other, what do you call them? Undocumented workers from the southern border go kinetic, or the Russians launch missiles, or the Chinese perform a high altitude EMP, or a Carrington event, X-class solar flare, whatever. It's a single event. Everything's fine, and then boom, 1 second after, whatever that book is, right, that everybody loves to read and then point back to as if it's some type of documentary or scientific study rather than a fiction novel. And is there good stuff in there? Sure. Am I going to bet my life on a fiction novel? No. No, I'm not. So a lot of people think it's a single event. I trend in the direction of it's a slow burn comprised of multiple smaller single events in a controlled demolition, if you will, of the status quo in order to coalesce power and authority and money at the highest echelons of society, so that those who are acting upon us can continue to act upon us, and we have less and less leverage to maintain a comfortable distance from tyranny. And I think the reason it's a controlled demolition is so that just like boiling a frog in a pot, that the normal people, if you will, the normies, are desensitized to what is happening around them. If you continuously shift the Overton window slowly, one day people wake up and ask, how did we get here? Instead of a single event, which shocks people to their core and has the potential to polarize people, which is the opposite of what the big they want, I think. They want their useful idiots indoctrinated in public schools. They want their slave wage workers. They want their people who are dependent upon them through socialism and government spending. They want that. They don't necessarily want to destroy the system, because the system works in their favor. That should be obvious. If you're a tax-paying American, the system works in their favor, not ours. But they want to continue to modify the system more and more so that you and I have less and less input as to how the system is run. Dominion voting machines, anyone? Does anybody really believe that Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. got 81 million votes in 2020? No. So the system, I think, is being slowly modified, and it's intentionally slowly modified so that they don't wake up the normies, and so that they can usher in their version of socialism, which will eventually lead to their version of communism, which will eventually lead to the death of good people, because communism always does. And where in there, which single event during that slow burn do we say, oh, the shit has hit the fan now? That's my issue with the term SHTF. I think it's a stupid term, and because it's an undefined term, it leads to what biblically we would call unequal weights and measures. Unequal weights and measures are an abomination, according to the creator of the universe and his divinely inspired word. So it's not a term that I really want to continue to bandy about. That being said, what are some facets of SHTF? How could one diagnose, oh, we're in it now. The poo has hit le ventilator. perhaps. What are the road signs for SHTF? Well, I'm currently recording this while on a leave from deployment with Grindstone Ministries, and we do disaster relief, and we are deployed in Barnesville, Oklahoma as of the time of this recording for our 43rd tornado or hurricane in about 5 years. And there's some patterns with a natural disaster that I think emulate SHTF, which illustrates yet again SHTF doesn't necessarily have to be man-made, because if an EF5 tornado wipes out your town, your entire town, it doesn't matter what Putin or Xi or Biden or Trudeau or Macron are doing. Doesn't matter anymore. Your world just got really small. It's SHTF for you now. And so some features that I've observed of this natural disaster-esque SHTF, in no particular order. There will be curfews and or martial law. With that, you have moderate to severe traffic control, controlled access. Areas become go, no-go, because elements of the state, whether that's the state troopers, highway patrol, county sheriffs, emergency management teams, whatever, declare this area a no-go zone. And the only way you are getting in or out of the no-go zone is if you have the appropriate paperwork that has been provided to you by whoever it is that's in charge. Oh, by the way, it's oftentimes unclear who it is that's in charge. It's one of the reasons that I registered Grindstone nationally as a 501c3. We have the same authority as the American Red Cross. And so hierarchically, we don't, FEMA isn't over us and we aren't over FEMA. We have similar levels of authority, which means more or less legally, I could do whatever the hell I want. And I like it that way. It removes a lot of the red tape from operating in the field after one of these events. But very rarely is it clearly defined who is in charge. And that's a facet of SHTF as well. There's oftentimes multiple competing factions. It might be the local emergency management and the county emergency management and the state emergency management and the federal emergency management and the local law enforcement, county law enforcement, state law enforcement, rarely federal law enforcement, but that could happen. You could have the National Guard deployed. That's happened on many an occasion. Mayfield, Kentucky, anyone? Rolling Fork, we were in a National Guard armory. Our FOB was a National Guard armory. But it's unclear who's in charge. What about politically? Is it the mayor? Is it the county commissioners? Is it the state governor? So there's a lot of ambiguity over who has legal authority in this situation now post-event. But controlled access, curfews, and martial law. Like, for example, after 9 p.m., it's assumed that if you're out and about, you're a bad guy. And when law enforcement or emergency management interacts with you post 9 p.m., the assumption will be you're a bad guy, especially if you're in one of the no-go zones that has been declared, that is cordoned off, that you have to get past law enforcement or emergency management personnel into that area. They will begin their interaction with you assuming that you're a bad guy. Again, in no particular order, no power, no electricity, and the cascading effects that come from no power. So obvious things like the grid goes down. All right, could that be a high altitude EMP or a coronal mass ejection, X-class flare, Carrington event, localized or regional sleeper cells that attack the grid? All that's possible. But what does it actually do? So first of all, it's psychological, because there's so many facets of our life today that are dependent upon the successful flow of electrons. And when you interrupt that, it has a huge psychological effect on the populace, on the normies. It also greatly compounds the inability of law enforcement and emergency management to be effective. Because even if they have hardened systems, even if they have backup generation, the number one thing that no power does in an emergency is it compromises communication. And communication, without commo, we have no logistics. And without logistics, we can't actually control the situation. So no power, cascading effects, commo is huge. So what does this mean for you? You should have a way to make communications, make commo without the grid being operational. And then what commo? Because this agency's on VTAC and this agency's still using VHF radios, and then this agency's using rolling encryption or frequency hopping, blah, 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 and they can't talk to each other. You know who usually catches the brunt of that? It's usually the county sheriff dispatcher. Usually, not always, but all of a sudden, the county sheriff's dispatcher becomes the pass-through for all critical information, oftentimes using the county's band. Well, that information is published, and in many jurisdictions, you can monitor your county sheriff's band. That, from an intelligence standpoint, that tells you a lot about who's doing what when. Law enforcement and emergency medical services are stretched thin almost immediately. Mutual aid is generally applied, meaning that other communities in the area will supply firefighters, paramedics, EMTs, and peace officers to the affected area. In a widespread event, they are dealing with the event themselves. So they don't have additional personnel that they can shift over to you with your disaster because they have their own disaster going on. And so what typically happens is that when the event happens, it goes down. Boom. The poo hit the fan. When that happens, everybody is stood up. Okay, so all law enforcement personnel, all emergency medical personnel, all emergency management personnel, all firefighters, career and volunteer, everybody stood up. And then within 72 hours, because they haven't slept, they don't have good commo, which adds to stress. They have this huge external stressing factor, whatever the event was that happened. By 72 hours, after sleeping in their ambulances or their patrol cars, they're smoked, they're wrecked. And so one of the things we tell people all the time is you gotta constitute a reserve. On day one, in 1 hour after the event, you take a third of your people, you stand them down and you rest them. And then you use those people on day 2 and 3, and your people who were there on day 1, you rest them, you bring them back in on day 4. Which adds to the chaos and the lack of clear chain of command. Unified chain of command generally doesn't exist until about a week or 2 later, until that all gets sorted out. And all of the boys and girls on the front lines, the thin blue line, the thin red line, they are smoked, they're trashed. And in many cases, their homes or their families have been directly affected as well. So again, psychologically, they may be here, boots on the ground, but their mind is somewhere else. And they need help too. And so not all of them can or will show up because their living situation has been compromised as well. Medical. No power means no hospitals, no clinics, no MRI machine, CAT scans, x-rays, EKGs, sonograms, all of which is diagnostic tools, right? Imagery, all that goes down. Most hospitals have backup generators. The backup generators are designed to operate the hospital at 10% load. And so what happens typically is the hospital shuts down everything other than the ICU and the NICU if they have one. And there's no more ER because there's no triage, because there's no rooms in the ER, there's no beds in the ER. The operating rooms shut down. All that. So medical just basically goes away about that fast. So another facet of what SHTF would look like is a lack of access to medical treatment. Here's a big one that most people miss, is sanitation. Water doesn't flow because the electric pumps aren't pumping it up into the water towers to get gravitational pressure on the lines on the system to push that water, hydraulic pressure created by lifting the column of water up into the sky. That all goes away. And a lot of times there's busted pipes, busted gas lines. Ooh, that's a big part of how the go, no-go areas are defined is busted gas lines. because one spark, homie, and we got a crater and maybe a fire that we can never put out again, like that town in Pennsylvania. But you lose running water and oftentimes sewer as well. If you have septic, that's great. But a lot of people don't have septic, they have sewer. And so within 24 hours, usually the water pressure's gone because there's leaks in the system and because we're not pumping water back up into the water towers. And then usually within 72 hours, the sewer systems stop working because the wastewater treatment plants have gone down. And those pipes in the ground, the tubes of poo get backed up and they start leaking out elsewhere, which creates a huge sanitary problem, right? Flies, fingers, feces. These are 3 ways people tend to transmit infectious disease. Yeah, well, feces backing up out of your toilet is a bad thing. I'd call that SHTF. And then cascading effects of no power. Lack of intelligence, lack of intel. Because commo's down. Because Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, where I don't understand how, YouTube, a lot of people get a lot of their information from. Maybe AM radio channels if you have an AM radio and if they can still broadcast. But the general wealth of information is consolidated into, in many cases, single points of information. So you get what materializes as information control. This would be briefs from FEMA that are filtered through the local emergency management personnel that are released on Facebook, as if everybody in the town can watch Facebook or is even following the mayor, the emergency management, on Facebook in the first place. And then they will say, well, we put it on Facebook. That doesn't mean everybody saw it. Okay, so then the people who did see it on Facebook are then telling others verbally, and then you get the telephone game. And so information control and intelligence, huge facet of SHTF. I'd argue right now we do have single points of information control with multiple filters in order for information to get from my mouth to your ears. There's a lot of different, how should we call them, entities that information has to filter through because of the platform that we're using. So you see that in natural disasters, which are a facsimile of SHTF as well. Outside authorities, another feature. Your little town of, Nowheresville, population 1,000. Okay, so you have your guy or girl who's the emergency manager / school principal / wrestling coach / associate pastor at the church, right? Because it's a small town and everybody wears multiple hats. All right, now the outside authorities come in because we need help. Who? In this case, it'll be county or state or even federal. But haven't we seen in other places around the world when they're in their SHTF, with civil unrest or genocides taking place or famine, outside forces come in, whether it's the UN Blue Helmets, peacekeepers, or it's the Red Cross, or it's UNICEF, or multiple other NGOs. There's outside authorities that come in who arguably don't have any jurisdictional standing here in the first place. So that's something to look for in SHTF. Displaced peoples. There's people on foot moving about the battle space because they can't stay where they were. That usually happens within the first 72 hours. After about day 3, the displaced peoples have settled somewhere else. Not all of them, but most of them. So displaced peoples can't stay here. It's not possible for me to live here. I'm going somewhere else. You get a lot of that in natural disasters. How about civil unrest and looting? In Dulac, was it Dulac, Louisiana? Dulac, D-U-L-A-C. People were getting shot in the face over 5-gallon gas cans after dark. Happens all the time. In Barnesville, Oklahoma, there are people pretending that they were locals, that they were the homeowners, coming onto properties and sifting through the debris and stealing, snap-on toolboxes and chainsaws and grandpa's war medals and stuff like that. Looting. That's straight up looting. And then dealing with that is, again, more difficult because of the compounding effects of no power, which means no commo, which means no intel, and outside authorities, who's in charge of what, where, who has jurisdiction over what. So it creates a lot of gray area for people to operate in, righteously or unrighteously. The bad people use the gray area to steal stuff from other people. Grindstone uses the gray area to get in there and get stuff done without asking permission from whatever entity thinks they're in charge today. So the gray area exists for a period of time. Usually the first couple of weeks, there's a gray area there until things start to solidify, cement, and the power struggle sorts itself out. Notes for you, SHTF. Civil unrest, people behaving badly. What about food? There's a lot of people who are dependent upon outside personnel, usually NGOs and 501c3s, that will come in and cook and provide food and water and sanitary needs, diapers, wipes, lady products, shampoo, soaps, bleach, cleaners, cleaning products, etc. Because flies, fingers, feces, right? So, but a lot of these groups, food, Mercy Chefs, what do? They come in, and Mercy Chefs in Barnstable was cooking 1,700 meals a day. 1,700 meals a day. I'm sorry, 1,700 meals per day. Yep, because there's about 550 out of a town of 1,000, 550 displaced residents, so 55%. So 550 times 3 gets you to 1,650, doesn't it? Yeah, and Mercy Chefs is cooking 1,700 meals a day. What happens if there's no food to feed those 550 people? They go somewhere else, or they find somebody to take it from because they're now desperate. They're on day 3 of no food. I touched on this, but we'll touch on it again. Loss of effective governance. Loss of effective governance. Nobody knows who's in charge. And there's a bunch of jurisdictional pissing contests that take place. And as a result, oftentimes what you'll see is factions forming politically based upon pre-existing networks of people who liked each other before the event. And then you'll see kind of like rogue elements. Again, give you an example. Barnstable, Oklahoma. Sector 5 belongs to Grindstone. That's our sector. We're a neutral entity. But if we wanted to be, arguably good entity, we're there to help. But if we wanted to be bad, we could. We could take and hold Sector 5 because there's more of us than anybody else. There's more of us than locals in the area in Sector 5. There's more of us certainly than the law enforcement emergency management personnel. So if we wanted to take and hold Sector 5, we could. Especially since there's only one road in and out of Sector 5. Right? So you see different factions forming. Due to a loss of effective governance, nature abhors a void. So people step into that power vacuum and start taking control of the situation. Whether this be the local school superintendent or the local pastors or the football coach or the mayor or whatever, these little fiefdoms develop where this part on the map is controlled by these people, regardless of whether or not the government has control over this area. Almost like gang turf, right? Go to Chicago. Yeah, they might be in the jurisdiction of the city of Chicago, but the mayor does not control that area. That's controlled by the Bloods or the Crips or MS-13 or whoever. So you see a lot of that. And so these are facets of what the prepper community would call SHTF. Shit has hit the fan, bro. That I have observed multiple times in natural disasters. Curfews, martial law, no power and the cascading effects thereof, commo, law enforcement, emergency medical services, sanitation, intelligence, displaced peoples, civil unrest and looting, a lack of food and water in the area, loss of effective governance, single point of information control, critical, that happens a lot, and then outside authorities. I think you could say all of those things would constitute an SHTF type event, whether it's the Russians or the Chinese or our own government or the Pleiadians or whoever. And so, to recap, I think SHTF is a stupid term because it's an undefined term, which is unequal weights and measures. And I don't think we're going to be looking for a single event. And I don't think that there will be a single event because they, the big they, are working on a controlled demolition of the system as we understand it to benefit them, not to benefit us, so that they can continue to coalesce power at the highest echelons of our society without waking up the normies while they're doing it. And then they're going to continue to usher in their particular brand of socialism, which will lead to their particular brand of communism, which will lead historically, statistically, to the deaths of millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of good people killed by their own government. Why? To remove the useful or the useless eaters, to have a more utopian society. And it's utopian for them, the overlords. It's not utopian for us. It's dystopian for us. But I think it's going to be a slow burn, y'all, which is why I gave you all these different things to look at so that you can use them as indicators in your life, in your daily walk, to determine, are we in SHTF? Because that's such an amorphous term that it's hard to define if we are or aren't in SHTF. And therefore, it breeds chaos in the prepper community of people trying to prepare for something that hasn't even been defined. I hope you all found value in this. If you're not subscribed, please consider subscribing. Share this show with somebody that you love. And of course, all the useful links are in the description down below. Y'all have a blessed day. Shalom.